Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to the show, James.
Well, thank you for having me back. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
What were the headlines in Asia following the G20 meeting?
I think with any G20, it's more about the side deals and other things that are done in other negotiations. And I think from a Canadian perspective, perhaps the most interesting is the recent goodwill mission that Canada just did to Beijing, led by Governor General David Johnston, that is seen as preparatory to what is expected to be Justin Trudeau's second visit as PM to China later this year. So some preparatory framework going on for some attempts to bolster Chinese-Canada trade. So I think those types of things are probably more important than whatever was hashed out in open discussion at the G20. I think this is perhaps the sign of the times that we're living in, rather than these kind of grand G20 type events. I think the real interest is happening in bilateral negotiations and meetings, as evidenced perhaps by the EU and Japan free trade agreement that they hammered out earlier this month, or the Chinese EU free trade agreement that they're talking about.
Canada, how popular is it with the rich Chinese?
Exceedingly popular and becoming more popular. As you may have heard, Canada has just surpassed the UK for the first time to become the second top immigration destination for the rich and lavish lifestyles of the Chinese millionaires and billionaires. So the U.S., of course, remains as the number one destination for Chinese emigres, but Canada is now in the number two position as the U.S. is starting to slump. U.S. cities are becoming less of a destination for rich Chinese during the Trump administration. So take that for what it's worth, but certainly Chinese nationals, and this specifically ranks nationals with a wealth of between $1.5 million and $30 million U.S. dollars, favored Canada as the second top destination. And when you break it down by city, you won't be surprised, I'm sure, to learn that Vancouver is the number 5 overall city destination, right behind Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, and New York.
China's propaganda has been bragging that because of a misled U.S., it's now making China great again. Is that how they look at the U.S. right now? Somebody who's stumbling and they can take advantage of it?
I think they are certainly looking to take advantage in any way they can. And certainly if the U.S. does retreat into a shell, then the Chinese are certainly there to take up that slack and to fill in the gap. So we can see that in a number of different ways. Of course, just overall Chinese investment that's happening right now, of course, under the rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative that we've talked about here, but also in some ways that are less open and less understood. So, for example, the South China Morning Post just had an interesting article by Ian Young about a Chinese policy instrument is buying into a Vancouver mountain, and it's talking about the sale of Grouse Mountain, or the ski operation thereon, to a buyer called GM Resorts Limited Partnership, which is 40% owned by CMIG, the China Minsheng Investment Group. And as this South China Morning Post article points out, the CMIG is nominally, on paper, a private investment company. It's just a free market phenomenon. But in reality, it was created as the result of a direct order from Chinese Premier Li Keqiang back in 2014. And it now is basically an investment vehicle for 59 of the biggest Chinese firms. And it was started off with 50 billion yuan, that's 7.4 billion in capital. It now has over 200 billion yuan in capital. So it's expanding, and it's looking for places to buy. And Grouse Mountain was one of those places, not only because of the ski operation there, of course, but also because it comes with 500 hectares of private land. And I think this can be seen as another way that China is throwing its power around, its soft power, its economic power, not necessarily through state investment vehicles, or at least not what is on paper state investment vehicles, but through these quasi-private firms, which are also tools for Chinese foreign policy. And I think that's the theme for the coming years, and the way that I think they're going to try to spread their power around more generally.
Yeah, I'm sure there are fears in North Vancouver that the plan for Grouse Mountain is to have a forest of condos pop up there.
It may be a possibility. We'll have to see what eventuates. But at any rate, it is there, and it is now 40% under the ownership of a Chinese quasi-private, really kind of state-owned investment vehicle.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond-producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109-carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
Lotus Ventures Inc. is a BC-based medical marijuana company poised to launch into the rapidly evolving cannabis sector. Lotus is in the final review stage of the Health Canada approvals to become a licensed producer, having arranged facility financing of up to $12 million, plus building permits for its prototype indoor production facility. Shares trade under the symbol J on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Visit our website at lotusventures.ca.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, I'm sure you're shocked to hear that China just announced that in its last quarter, growth was 6.9%.
I'm shocked. Absolutely shocked. Yes. Well, for people who don't know, the Chinese government, of course, sets its quarterly targets for GDP growth. And it seems pretty much every single quarter they are bang on, exactly on the button when it comes to their GDP predictions. So I'm not sure if 6.9 was exactly what they were going for, but at any rate, it's certainly within their range that they're hoping for. And so wouldn't you know it, 6.9% growth. So I guess everything's going tickety-boo. As always, I think we have to add the caveat that the numbers that are cooked up as to China's GDP are cooked up, and explicitly so, and admittedly so. That previously mentioned Premier Li Keqiang a few years ago in a diplomatic cable that was leaked by WikiLeaks privately admits that he does not even trust China's official GDP numbers, that in order to really understand what's going on, you have to look at more underlying economic data that generally isn't faked, like the extent of rail transit and transport and things like that, energy usage. Those types of numbers generally are reliable, and from that you can construct something resembling a GDP. But these numbers that they throw out, the headline numbers, really are either pulled out of thin air or heavily doctored. And you can see that when you add up the individual regional GDP numbers that are reported and then look at the overall headline national numbers, they don't add up. They literally don't add up. You generally get GDPs from the state levels that add up to less than the overall GDP for the nation itself, in a way that just doesn't make any economic sense. So I don't think anyone takes this very seriously. It's really more of a gauge of is the economy expanding, contracting, or staying about equal? And I think that's the way we have to look at these numbers.
Is China having any success getting people to move into those big artificial cities?
Well, I think there is, demonstrably, we are seeing more housing growth and price growth in secondary markets and smaller markets now. So I think part of that has to be run off to these so-called ghost cities that are starting to see people flooding in at this point. And I think obviously this has been the plan all along, to try to force people into these areas. And I think part of what has accomplished that is just the the sort of runaway prices in the major centers, Beijing and Shanghai and other places. So we are seeing more of a push for people moving into the so-called secondary markets or cities, and part of that is going to be in these ghost cities.
Do they also have ghost airports?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about the transportation infrastructure that exists around these places, but surely there must be some degree of at least ghost highways and bridges. As people may know, a lot of the GDP growth, quote unquote, of the last several years has been infrastructure related and has been basically debt money that's been printed up by the Chinese government in order to continue to fuel the boom. And so there has been a lot of infrastructure created largely around the creation of these types of ghost cities and other places that, again, maybe theoretically may be coming into use, but certainly haven't been used that much yet. So I'm not sure about ghost airports, but certainly ghost highways and bridges.
How is China's expansion of their high-speed rail network going?
I haven't seen the latest on that, but as people know, they have been pioneering in that area and certainly trying to bring high-speed rail into the 21st century. If Japan was the 20th century leaders in that technology, I think China is at least trying to be the 21st century leaders in that. And I think part of that ultimately is going to be not just obviously internal to China, but spreading that technology around in Asia generally, but then even further afield. So it's going to be, I think, interesting to see the way that some of these nations along that One Belt, One Road path that they're trying to form between China and Europe, the way they react to the spreading of some of these technologies and whether that causes German suppliers and manufacturers, for example, to step up their game, or whether China will become the leader in this emerging market. But at any rate, there's quite a lot of railway that's going on right now. The Haramain line between Saudi Arabia, cities of Medina and Mecca, for example, or the Moscow-Kazan line, or the Budapest-Belgrade line, that are multi-billion-dollar projects, all of them. And Beijing is looking to either finance these various railway projects or supply some of the manufacturing for them. So it's going to be interesting to see whether this becomes one of the ways that China spreads its soft economic power and helps spread its influence around the Asian area generally and also the Eurasian area.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp, RMO on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario. With grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold, a drill program will commence this spring to test the numerous targets located by recent groundwork. For more information, visit our website, rmroyalty.com.
Keep informed. Receive our weekly recap of thought-provoking articles, podcasts, and radio delivered to your inbox for free. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage, HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're chatting with James Corbett. James, what's the feeling in Asia with China opening its first foreign military base in Africa in Djibouti? Do they have more plans to do more of the same?
Well, I think they do. At any rate, Djibouti certainly is strategic for Chinese interests in Africa, specifically as it relates to the trading routes and getting some of the resources out of Africa to China. I think Djibouti becomes an important part of that. As to Asian reaction to that, I think the Asian reaction is more concerned with obviously the Asian space, specifically the South China Sea, obviously, still a contentious subject. And I think that's where people will see a lot of the kind of ASEAN reaction to China's growing naval / regional military growth. But I think the Djibouti base has to be seen as one part of that and an extension of that. And I think probably the people who are more concerned about that and have their eye on Djibouti in particular are AFRICOM, the U.S. African Command, and their associated allies. I think probably have a close eye on what's happening with Djibouti and where else they may be expanding in the future.
Indonesia apparently is very concerned about China's expansion into the South China Sea.
Yes, they're certainly not the only ones, but Indonesia and China are, they're stepping up a war of words right now. And the latest is that Indonesia is basically calling the Chinese expansion into the South China Sea as a foreign threat and an encroachment. I don't think they've used the word enemy at this point, but certainly that is the implication. So again, it's going to be a very contentious point, and I think this is the point where a lot of the other issues that are rising to the surface as China becomes more of an economic might may take place diplomatically and potentially even militarily. The real question, as usual with so much geopolitical wrangling, is the extent to which China can get away with, as it were, extending their so-called 9-dash line, the area that they say they control in the South China Sea, and whether or not Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, whether they'll all go along with that, or at any rate be forced to kind of go along with that. The question is, what kind of resistance can they put up? And Indonesia has maintained its exclusive economic zone in the waters that are currently claimed by Beijing, but it's a question of what they can actually do about it. And now that China is commissioning its very own aircraft carrier and really starting to flex its naval might, it really is a question whether Indonesia can do anything at all on its own, or whether it's kind of relying on the network of the Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam and these other interested actors in conjunction, of course, with the U.S. military umbrella that is the implied threat here, whether that's really going to help determine what happens in the South China Sea.
How long can Hong Kong maintain its so-called independence from China?
That's a very good question, and one that is very much on the table. As you may have seen, after Xi Jinping's recent visit to Hong Kong, there was a large protest in the tens of thousands, depending whether you ask the Hong Kong authorities or whether you ask the protesters themselves. You get a wildly varying number. But anyway, tens of thousands of people did take to the streets of Hong Kong to protest Xi Jinping's essentially warning to Hong Kong to say that you are part of one China and we will exert our control over you. Of course, this coming around the 20th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China, and Xi Jinping's kind of warning. It has to be seen as a kind of a veiled threat that Hong Kong can't get too out of line. So I think this is obviously an issue. But again, the question is, what can the people of Hong Kong really do about it? I think the best that they can hope for in the current geopolitical climate / economic climate is to maintain the status quo of Hong Kong being a special administrative region that can play it by its own rules to a certain extent and can have some degree, a little bit more autonomy. But in the end, I think if that was ever to really try to threaten Beijing or Beijing's edicts in any serious manner, I think we would see a more significant crackdown. And I think that's what Xi Jinping's recent visit has to be seen in light of. So ultimately, I don't think the prospects for the protesters are all that bright at this point.
Would the Chinese government be careful because Hong Kong generates so much of the economic growth in China?
I think that's one of the considerations here, and I think that China is mindful that if you press too hard too quickly, there is going to be backlash. So I think it is, I don't want to say Cold War per se, but at any rate, there is an icy tenor to the relations that both sides know that making any dramatic moves, kind of like the Taiwan situation, making dramatic moves is what's going to rock the boat. And I don't think either side is interested in that at the moment. But it is an open question as China's own homegrown domestic economic influence expands and as Beijing becomes more of a center of economic clout, whether or not they'll necessarily need that Hong Kong appendage for the financial system to function the way that it has. So there is a point at which it's at least conceivable that perhaps that will not be as much of a concern for the Beijing government, but clearly that's not right now. We're talking longer term.
How nervous are people in Japan following the latest ballistic missile test from North Korea?
It is obviously a concern and a growing one, and so we have seen a lot of diplomatic and even military talk about responses to this. But again, I think the real question here is the United States and how it reacts to this. I think Japan is still firmly under the U.S. military umbrella, so it really does depend as to what the Trump administration is going to do as to ultimately what happens with Japan. But I think the main concern, at least the immediate concern, would have to be, as it has been for some time, that there are very many U.S. military bases and military personnel here in Japan, which would be prime targets for North Korea. I still think the number one target that would have to be worried about being in those crosshairs is South Korea, but Japan would be second, and potentially, theoretically, Alaska or Hawaii might be third. But I think that's still a distant prospect, even though that's being hyped up in the U.S. media right now. I think clearly Japan should be more worried about being in the crosshairs of any immediate attack.
Any success yet in trying to control the Fukushima meltdown?
Well, I mean, not really, not fundamentally, as the melted down reactors are still really the core of the issue, if you'll excuse the pun, and there's really been no progress made on that. But there is the Japanese government is now talking about releasing 700,000 tons of waste from the Fukushima plant directly into the Pacific, which they say it's okay, it's not a big deal because this is tritium, which it can cause cancer in high concentrations, but when diluted into the ocean isn't going to make a difference. Of course, we've heard these types of assurances from governments before, and I think the Japanese public as well as the public generally are right to be very wary about that. So that's a pretty contentious issue that's going on right now. And the latest is that a swimming robot has captured underwater images of the damaged reactor. So they may have actually found part of the actual reactor itself, but the idea of cleaning up that melted down reactor is still a very, very distant prospect. So I don't think any fundamental change has really occurred to the situation.
Are the Japanese worried about radiation in their fish?
Not generally. It is not a widespread concern, and to the extent that it is a concern, it might be a concern in the direct Fukushima Bay region, but certainly not generally. And anecdotally, I have not noticed any difference whatsoever to Japanese seafood consumption patterns. No one thinks twice about going to a sushi restaurant here or asking what part of the country any fish is sourced from. I haven't noticed any culinary changes. I haven't heard anyone talking about that. It isn't really covered in the mainstream media here. So I think if there is concern, it's a niche market here, and I don't think a lot of people generally have it on their minds in day-to-day living.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HighStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show or for our guests can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.